and welcome to PostGame. My name's Brian Collier. I am one of the pastors here at the Orchard, and I preached on Sunday from Revelation 12. And it's an interesting conversation today because Colby Cuevas, who is another one of our pastors, preached at our Starkville campus, same text. So it's kind of a back and forth this morning, more so than just questions, right?
Yeah. All the things that we couldn't cover or wish we could have gone into further detail in our sermon. You know, the shavings that are left on the chopping block in the creation process of our sermon. We love to bring those shavings back out and kind of continue to have the conversation that we started yesterday. So as we jump in to this conversation today, as we carry it on, we'd love to kind of pick up some of the points that Brian mentioned and kind of explore them in more detail. And one of those points was this aspect of Revelation is often thought of as a future text or a future book of the Bible that talks about heaven one day and what we can look forward to.
End times, yeah.
End times, certainly a part of that. Or people think it's something that already happened. It's in the past.
Yeah, history.
Yeah, so what does the book of Revelation have to do with today, with now, for the believer?
You know, the nature of Revelation is it has happened, it is happening, and it will happen. And, of course, eventually it will happen once and for all and be done. But we don't know when in that continuum that we live. In fact, I was told them a couple weeks ago, we have a lot of people who are way more interested in when it's going to happen than what's going to happen. They've got their calendars out, they're reading Revelation, they're trying to mark the calendar, and that's just really just not possible, because that's not the way Revelation's to be read. It's to give us an insight into what God is doing and how God is at work in the world as he moves us toward judgment, as he moves us toward the end of time, in a way that we can live meaningfully in it, not fearfully, but meaningfully in it. So,
yeah, I love that this apocalyptic vision that John has is God's perspective, right? A heavenly perspective on today for the seven churches then across Asia Minor, but even for us today, what is a God's perspective in our lives and our situations?
Well, again, something I've said a couple of times, because it's really just captured me during this whole preparation part of Revelation, is that God lets us see through John's writing it down. And there's a couple of times in Revelation, chapter 10 is one example where there's an interlude between things happening. It's almost as if God says, okay, I've given you a lot, let's stop right here so you can understand what's going on, so that as the people of God, we can react differently than the world does. And that's meant to be twofold. One is that we can encourage one another because we know God's at work. In a world that sometimes looks up and goes, hey, it's just chaos and disorder and power grab and everybody for themselves, as followers of Jesus, we can say, no. Let's make sure we keep God's perspective on this. And the other thing we get to do because of that is we get to invite others into an alternative way of living, outsiders who are fearful or who are dominated by power or dominated. We can say you don't have to live like that. There's an alternative way. So that perspective that John gives us, that God's given us through John, is really a pretty amazing opportunity for us.
Right. And you kind of answered the very question that I was thinking of in terms of how would you encourage people not to ignore that aspect of how fearful it could be, or that it's a future or a past event, but encourage them to see God's work in his hand and how God is empowering people and encouraging people to not, like Brittany, I would say, if she were a part of this conversation, my wife, she would say that I could look like a dragon at times when I'm grasping for power or control. Yeah. And then that desire takes over me. I become, a seven-headed beast and horns and crowns, that's my embodiment. So
yeah, I think the thing is to remember that we can live differently. So it's a word of encouragement to one another if we're Christians, and if we're not Christians, it's an opportunity to invite people into faith so they don't have to live in a way that the world has prescribed.
Yeah, it's so taxing, and just you can go on forever trying to figure it out and get stuck in your head. And
pursuit of so many things that'll never satisfy you.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so in the sermon, you said that the battle begins with the birth of the child,
Yeah.
and it ends with the cross of Christ. And this is just a really a battle chapter. I
Yeah.
mean, it's the epitome of, the forces of good and evil, the dragon and Satan, the ancient serpent, fighting with his army against Michael, the archangel, and the angels of God, and they're fighting. But I love how you bring it back to it's about Jesus.
Yeah.
Say a little bit more about that.
Well, the birth of Jesus is announced, and you pointed out that the whole work of Jesus is in one verse. The baby is born. He is not devoured by Satan, and his mission is accomplished, and he's caught up into heaven. That's one verse in the middle of this chapter, and so you have to kind of see a little bit more depth to this one line, and the depth of it is that we know that Jesus comes, and that's his stepping into the world to rescue humanity, and the devil's like, no, this is my territory. So he's fighting tooth and nail. So he tries to destroy the child. When he can't destroy the child, we know that he tries to destroy the man by crucifying him on the cross, and he thinks he's won. But the cross becomes the announcement that Jesus has defeated even death, and in defeating death, then the victory is won. Later on, verse 11, it says, "They won, they endured, they survived, they overcame by the blood of the Lamb," and so just the victory is given to us. The battle is started by the birth of Jesus. God steps into the world to fight for us, and He wins the victory by laying down His life willingly on the cross.
Yeah. I love how John says it in his first letter, 1 John 3:8, where he says, Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil.
Yeah.
He gets pretty specific. Pretty clear.
Yeah.
That's absolutely good news. Another main point that you lifted up in your sermon is that we live in a reality where all of this is happening around us. You mentioned a second ago the chaos, the suffering, the disorder, the confusion. But that we should be hopeful and people who deliver hope to the world.
Yeah.
That we should be hopeful and that we should be people who deliver hope to the world. What did you mean by that, and how do we do that?
Well, one of the central characters in this chapter is the woman, and there's a lot of conversation about who the woman is. I think it's pretty clear the woman is the church, and we are the way that Jesus is entering the world today. And this is part of that. It did happen. It is happening. It's really easy to understand that Jesus entered the world through a woman, a virgin named Mary. It did happen, but we also see Jesus entering the world today through the church. We're the way Jesus is birthed into the dark and chaotic circumstances of our world. And that's because we know that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb. We know that the devil's fate is sealed. We know that this is not the end of the story.
Imminent, yeah.
And so everywhere we go into all the dark circumstances of our lives, into the dark circumstances of the world, we get to be the way that Jesus enters into that circumstance. And we get to say, hey, it doesn't have to be like this. And we get to live in ways that testify that it doesn't have to be like that. So that's one of the most hopeful, it is the most hopeful thing that we could possibly do as followers of Jesus, is knowing the hope ourselves to be ways that hope enters into the circumstance is an incredible opportunity.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about actually tails nicely into a conversation I was having yesterday. I'm the recovery pastor here, and so I get to be a part of conversations where people are really kind of coming apart at the edges and kind of living their lives in such a way that it's just they're breaking down left and right. They don't know how to put things back together. And oftentimes it begins with anxiety, like this fear, this stress, this I can't figure it out, I don't have the power. But anxiety usually leads to depression. That depression leads to isolation. But once a person is isolated, it's almost like the devil has them.
Yeah.
They've got a target on their backs, because isolation, it's really hard to find hope by yourself.
Oh, yeah. That's a
And
good
so
word.
the church has the opportunity to build relationships with people who are hopeless, who are in depressed situations or full of anxiety, so that they can remind them, like, hey, look, I've been there, and look what God did for me, and invite them out of that, back into community, back into the work of Christ in our lives. And so,
Yeah, and so with that in mind, really, that's why persecution, and I'm careful with that word because the Western church really doesn't know what persecution is. But that's why difficulty comes, is because the devil wins twice. That person stays isolated, and we don't do our job. We don't get on mission with Jesus. Difficulty comes because the devil's not happy about that kind of relationship that you're talking about. He's like,
Build those bridges
no,
and
let's see what we can do. So the text says he comes after us. He wages war. It doesn't say he makes it inconvenient for us or it's difficult for us. It says he wages war. And so with that waging of the war, we just have to keep in mind that though the battle is raging, the outcome's already been settled. And that's the word of hope too in the middle of the difficulty. We shouldn't be surprised that the devil doesn't want us to engage someone who's isolated. He wants that person to remain isolated, and he wants us not to do our job. And he does everything he can to upset it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Power of hope. And you mentioned in the beginning of that last comment, this being careful with that word persecution. Maybe this will be the last piece that we bring up during this time together. And that's, one of those things you want to be hesitant about, because in the Western church in North America, in the Bible Belt in the South, it's a word that can, be taken to its extreme and exaggerated when we really don't know a lot of what that means.
We have no idea.
And yet this text its number one main intent, main purpose is to explain why persecution is happening from God's perspective.
Yep.
And so it's very clear throughout scriptures in the New Testament that, and the Old Testament has Israel being persecuted, and going into exile and whatnot, but specifically the church, Jesus says in John 15:20, a servant is not greater than a master. If it's happened to me, it's going to happen to you.
That's the way it is.
Paul says at 2 Timothy 3:16 or 3:6 that says, if you are living a godly life following Christ Jesus, you will be persecuted.
That's right.
Great encouragement there for you today. Promise. It's not going to maybe happen, possibly. It's a promise, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So how do we engage with those texts, and what does that mean for us when we talk about persecution? Say more about that.
No, I just think we have to embrace the difficulty. We have to be the ones who understand that in spite of the difficulty, the story I told yesterday is at the end the Lamb wins. I mean, the victory is settled, and all we're doing is marching through till the end. And some people have a harder march. People in the rest of the world have a much harder march than the people in North America. But we know we're doing the work of God when Satan opposes. If he ain't opposing us, maybe there's nothing to oppose. So, that might be the best way to wrap up today. There's so much more we could talk about, obviously, in chapter 12. But we just want to encourage you this week with the word of hope and say, you are the way that Jesus is entering into the difficult and dark circumstances of our world. So not only embrace that hope yourself, but be a person who passes that word along. Hope you have a great week. Look forward to seeing you again soon. See you.